presented the concept of South-South cooperation, which remains at the heart of IBSA, and you have pointed out to the complexities and challenges. We shall have a chance to further hear your views on the other aspects as well. May I now invite Professor Sriram Chaulia to address you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. Morning, everyone. Really a great honor to be with scholars from our three countries, all assembled in the same hall here. I want to put on record my special thanks to RIS for convening something like this, which I think is quite relevant in light of the seeming, the questions about the viability and the continuity of this unique institution itself. Ambassador Bhatia mentioned this, and I thought I will respond to some of the big questions Ambassador Bhatia raised as well. So to start with, Ambassador Bhatia asked us, and I had also planned to speak about this changing world dynamics. And Professor Lima also just mentioned it, and so did Professor Gumid. I think whether it's a crisis of capitalism, of course it is since 2008 for sure, but in the foreign policy realm, it is manifested as a crisis of multilateralism, right? Increasingly we find with the so-called liberal international order in doldrums, especially since Trump has arrived, the future of multilateral cooperation, countries coming together, solving collective problems, global governance issues which require multiple heads to come together and brainstorm, all those are under a cloud, because the US especially used to have that convening power, and as long as it was led by quote-unquote mainstream liberals, they used to do that on large issues, on major global issues. But since Trump's withdrawal from it, I've just finished a new book on Trump's impact on the rise of emerging powers. It's called Trumped, and it's coming out in October, November from Bloomsbury. But I have been thinking about this in terms of multilateralism, and it seems there are two to three elements here. One is problem solving, which is one of the core goals of multilateralism. So Professor Gumid already mentioned the climate crisis and how it is very, very relevant that we, IBSA especially, raise the salience of this issue in light of the US's withdrawal and abandonment of this cause. Because it's not about whether we are liberal or illiberal. I think that's a very Western frame of looking at things. We are not interested in the liberal order because we also face lots of iniquities and challenges under that in the past. So we don't buy the Western liberal view that somehow things are coming down crashing. We believe that emerging powers, especially we three, as well as probably larger formations, BRICS and BRICS Plus, can indeed uphold world order or regional orders without necessarily the so-called liberal hegemon. So nonetheless, this changing world dynamic, there are a couple of things. So one is the question of just the utility and the value of plurilateralism or small group or large group multilateralism. So I think at a broad level, to make us, given our situation, the United States can withdraw from multilateralism and still remain a great power, right? I mean, because it has accumulated wealth and influence and military dominance in many parts of the world. So even if they abandon and withdraw, which has started happening in the last 2 years, and if this is a secular trend and goes on even after Trump, the point is for us, we are what we can call ourselves a middle powers, right? IBSA countries. And middle powers, it's an established route to rise to great power status is through multilateralism. There is, of course, what we call the hard power, which depends on one's own resources and military and all those things. But at the diplomatic level, the sure shot route for middle powers to become great powers is multilateralism. So IBSA cannot be abandoned. IBSA cannot be seen as a vestige of the past and we must move forward. In fact, we cannot move forward without IBSA, because that's where we have some voice, some ability to coordinate, to pool resources, and to impact the world order. It's one of many. I'm not saying it's the only one, but so we must persist with it amid this crisis of multilateralism. On the economic front, Professor Lima was mentioning that in light of the trade wars, especially the China-US one, there is value in more intra-South trade cooperation. Yes, but I think it's more complex. If we see the debate in large developing countries, including our IBSA members, if you add a few more, I'm thinking of Nigeria, for example. It's 200 million people. It's the largest country in Africa, and so on. There are serious concerns about whether the trade war will actually harm them rather than benefit them. And what they mean by that, of course, is the diversion of the Chinese exports. If the Chinese are being blocked and walled from the North American market by Trump, where will all their overcapacity go? And is there a real fear of Chinese dumping in large developing countries? I know not all of us have the same trade profile with China. Brazil actually has a trade surplus with China, but we have a huge deficit with China. And I think South Africa also has a slight trade surplus because of the mineral exports. But India is not a mineral exporter, so it's the other way around. So there is a fear among a number of us about the possible ricochet effect of the trade war. So I think IBSA, in the current context, in the changed world dynamic, to use Ambassador Bhatia's phrase, we must actually evaluate the impact of this, especially vis-a-vis China, because I don't consider China as an emerging power. It's already a great power, or it's to use a very loose term. As an academic, I don't use it. It's already a superpower. So in terms of resources and capabilities and power projection influence, it is roughly equivalent, or in fact has overtaken the United States in many regions of the world, especially the developing world. So when we look at it, it's no longer this unipolar world. There is a very good Norwegian scholar, Øystein Tunstad, has just written a book claiming that we are at the beginning of a new bipolar era. And he is roughly comparing 2018-19 to 1948-49, when the Soviet Union was about 60% of the US's GDP and was trying to catch up. So if that is bipolar, Tunstad says, why is this? Multipolar, he says, is still somewhere up in the future. So I think the Chinese question, and that's the reason we have persisted with IBSA. You will all know the reason IBSA exists in spite of the overlap with BRICS is because we wanted a separate forum where we could discuss the potential negative impacts of the Chinese hegemony. So I think that has to come up, and I think there is a very interesting opportunity because of the change of power in Brazil. It's in a way a mixed bag, because on one hand, President Bolsonaro believes in cozying up with the US, and has been, it's in a way he's rejecting some of the South-South basis on which Brazil became a dominant player in the last 20 years, or maybe longer, since President Cardoso's time. So this, in this situation, some have argued that maybe he will downgrade BRICS and IBSA and all these things, and that they are no longer as essential to the Brazilian foreign policy strategy as they used to be in the past. But interestingly, I've been speaking to Brazilian diplomats for my book on Trump, and they say it's a very interesting nuance. They say BRICS may actually suffer from Brazilian neglect or cold shoulder. Of course, they are not going to quit it, but they're going to, and in fact, they are hosting this year's BRICS, I think, BRICS summit. They are the chair, but he said the president is not very enthusiastic about this because he thinks that BRICS is anti-Western and he doesn't want to anger Trump. So in that, but IBSA will carry on, and maybe he will have a greater interest in IBSA's promotion than BRICS. I said, why so? One, IBSA is democratic, and President Bolsonaro comes from far right, and he believes that socialism or communism is a big evil in the world and all those things. So there's no Russia, there's no China, and there's no blunt kind of anti-Western discourse in IBSA, although we also want a multipolar world and all that. But when the Russians come in, it's far more aggressive and far more anti-American. So he said Bolsonaro is going to persist more with IBSA, and he's going to promote it. I would like to see how that moves forward. Maybe the summit, the long-stalled summit, Ambassador Bhatia mentioned, and Brazil may take an initiative as it moves forward on this. So the question of China, I think, is quite paramount, and I think with the new regime in Brazil, it's mixed signals. Brazil still remains highly dependent on exports to China, but the new president has been talking about diversifying away from Chinese dependence. So it creates an interesting dynamic for IBSA possibly to gain, and we should be cognizant of that and look how we can engage with the Brazilians, especially at this time, to increase the cachet of IBSA vis-a-vis BRICS. Moving on to the other core areas, Ambassador Bhatia said, we need core areas for the Sherpas to focus on. Already, Professor Gumede mentioned the environmental issue, and Professor Lima was talking about the capitalism and the trade issues. But I want to also briefly reflect on the regional peace and democracy promotion, which of course is very central to IBSA's identity. Here, you may recall, IBSA during the heydays of when Lula, and it was actually a very happening thing. In those days we had, and after Lula, even under Dilma Rousseff and successive Indian and South African governments where there's more continuity, we had attempted to intervene in a way to resolve the Syrian civil war, or at least shown an interest in the early years, 2011-12, you may recall. It was a bold initiative. More than BRICS, it was actually IBSA that was active in trying to come up with a global South position, or at least prominent developing countries' position on trying to reconcile in the early stages of this most devastating war in the Middle East. I thought it was a very bold initiative. It went beyond our own, immediate neighborhoods. None of the three IBSA members actually shares a border or is close to the Middle East. Nonetheless, we did that initiative. Of course, it did not settle anything, and that war had too many proxy players, and it kept on going and was devastating. But I want to propose, and this is something where we need a multilateral approach. Each of us, in these three countries, have relative stability. We are secure states, and we are stable, and we also have influence in our immediate neighborhoods. So how can we enhance the capacity of the other two, each of us, to bring about regional peace and settlements in our respective areas? So this is, I will flag three countries of concern to IBSA members: Afghanistan, especially for India; Venezuela for Brazil; and the DRC, Congo, for South Africa. Now, if we think about it, here is a problem-solving opportunity for us, but we have significantly failed to exercise our responsibilities to bring about a settlement in any of these. And I feel like we have been inadequate, and I feel like we need more resources than ourselves. And we need some kind of small coalitions of the willing, if you like, especially at the diplomatic level, to be able to engage in these three major hotspots. Now, you look at Brazil and Venezuela, it's right next door. You all know, I don't have to mention the Venezuela crisis. Brazil is missing in action. Historically, Brazil wanted to keep out the United States and to unify South America and to solve the problems of the region collectively with other members without asserting any kind of overt hegemony. Some people used to call it consensual hegemony. South Africa similarly placed the largest economy in the southern African region. I look up to Nigeria also to solve most of the regional problems, although they have been thwarted by France. So what I'm saying, in this region, in India, again, the Chinese shadow, because of the geopolitical reasons, because of the geography, because we have a direct border, has been a major limitation on how far we could go on any of these. So what I'm suggesting is, if we can come up with an IBSA action plan, go back to the Syrian intervention, the brief diplomatic intervention we did. We sent a delegation, fact finding. We did not agree with the Western view at the time that Assad had to go, and that Assad was the only problem there, and we were highly worried about the funneling of money and funds for jihad by local actors that destabilize the country, and in a way, enable the rise of ISIS. So we have a distinct view. We are democracies, but we are not these liberal internationalists, right? We have been far more cagey about these military interventions, either overt or through proxies. And you go back in time to the Libya intervention of 2011, all of us felt we had been cheated by the Western powers. So I think there is a role for us there, and if we can identify how we could pool our combined resources and offer mediation, offer some peacemaking efforts, and insert ourselves into these problems. There's a problem which is internal to all our countries. Many of us feel that we should not be intervening in our neighborhoods because it will actually increase the insecurities of these small countries. Right? But what is leadership? I want to ask our friends, what is leadership if we do not take, we are not intervening the way the United States does with boots on the ground or with missiles launched from drones, right? We are talking about different type of regional peace and settlement, which involves diplomatic persuasion as well as working with key stakeholders. So let me now conclude by also talking about the global governance. Come back to the big question of global governance. I think the big challenge, I think, for all of us is to develop regionalism and interregionalism. These are all efforts. Many of us know, and we keep harking back to the fact that IBSA is a very unique intercontinental institution. It's not a regional organization like ASEAN or African Union or Mercosur or SAARC, right? So there is something to be extracted out of this phenomenon, the basic philosophy of interregionalism, which is that we don't have any strategic rivalries with each other. BRICS is more complex because China is there, and while neither Brazil nor South Africa feels Chinese pressure the way we do because we have we share a border with them. There are, as I said, trade and other issues where there is Chinese pressure. So I think we need to think about global governance and who will uphold it, because we need it, right? Because as I said, as middle powers, we need it, and we cannot forego it. So it's very essential that we think about mechanisms for upholding it in our respective regions. There has to be region building programs, in my view, in each of our three respective regions, with the explicit backing and the support of the other two. And we have to have this vector-based thinking. I think we have to give priority to the regional power and strengthen their hands. How do we strengthen their hands? I'm not going to go into nitty-gritty here, but this is the broader vision I think we should develop. And if we are able to really resolve some of these long-standing crises and stabilize them, I think that will be a huge. And this relates to the issue of terrorism that Ambassador Bhatia flagged. Although Brazil is relatively shielded from it, and I don't think is really geographically is not anywhere close to any kind of jihadist activity. On the other hand, in our region, this is a central question. So what can the other two, which are relatively less affected by it, do for us in this area? And what can we do for Brazil and South Africa on issue areas which do not directly affect us? So what I'm trying to say is, at the end of the day, the South-South rests upon the idea that we are not working in narrow self-interest, right? So we have to go beyond the transactionalism and the bilateralism that Trump is promoting. because that is purely based on very, very narrow self-interest, right? And I think we have to rise above it. I have questions about whether Bolsonaro will go along. He looks to me like the weak link right now, but there are these elements which can actually add up to being actually a booster for IBSA. So if we can take it forward from here and rebuild region building programs through economic connectivity, small scale connectivity projects, but that involve the other partners in our respective regions. If we can bring in, I have been a proponent of exchanging grassroots teachers of our respective countries to live in underserviced areas of the other countries and supporting them. You take the example of Brazil, with the doctors. The Cubans had come to help with the health crisis, and now President Bolsonaro has kicked them out. We know it. But the question is, if the Cubans can do it, the Indians can also do it. Of course, linguistically, we are not familiar with Portuguese. But what I'm suggesting is, let's think about, in the people-to-people dimension, some new project that will help health and education of each other. And I think at that level, the easiest thing is to have a Peace Corps type operation, where each of our countries has 20-25 young people going and serving in the other partner countries in locations identified by the host governments, where we do English and math and science and whatnot, and also maybe sharing civilizational and cultural knowledge about each other, because we are geographically quite separate. I mean, if you look at the map and the distances. So especially, I think with Brazil and India, the understanding is lower. With South Africa and India, because of the large diaspora connections, we are closer. So there's no harm in doing something like this, setting up a small fund like a volunteers for IBSA or something like that, with some support of all the three governments, and doing this. And they should reside there 2 to 3 years, earn the goodwill of local people, impart skills, and come back. So, and it will not make a massive impact on education or health of these countries. But let some of our doctors go. Let some of our teachers go. Think about it. We have academics here, and we're going to discuss academic cooperation later today. MOUs exist, but then they don't translate into Indian professors going and teaching in a South African university, or vice versa. But we should change those things, because ultimately those are the the lasting things, and that's what will really matter. Because at the level of elites, as we are seeing, maybe this time is different, and maybe if this populism thing continues, and if it spreads to more developing countries, then even our South-South cooperation is going to be imperiled. And already the clouds are gathering because of Trump. So I would end by simply saying that IBSA is relevant, and we need to latch on to some strategic signals based on this changing world dynamic, to use Ambassador Bhatia's words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.